I won't tell you what that way was, but they showed that the way they behaved determined the amount of eggs that were ovulated. And they were showing there's a relationship between how behavior influences the physiology of the fertile system. I was interested in studying that in humans, and it began with the menstrual cycle. And I asked women through a group of students like you. As a graduate student, I was able to find undergraduates who wanted to do a research study with a graduate student. And what happened was those students knocked on dorm doors, all women, knocked on women dorm doors and tried to enroll other women who would be research subjects who would be willing to fill out a menstrual calendar every day for a semester to say when they bled. And we wanted to, and a lot of other information we wanted to gather. At the end of the 14 weeks, I asked the research assistant, like you are, to ask the student, before she put her anonymous card into an envelope with a stamp on it addressed to me, where her research assistant would never see her personal information, write on that card what she thought in the last 14 weeks was her pattern of sexual behavior. Did she never miss a week of sexual intercourse? Did she never have sexual intercourse, or somewhere in between? And when we plotted the data, when we got all the data back, 20 of the women said they were weekly, 20 said they were sporadic, and 20 said they were never. And of the 20 who said they were weekly, the cycle length, the average menstrual cycle length, you see the pattern there? That every one of them was within 3 days of a 29.5-day cycle. Whereas the nevers and the sporadics could be in that range, being around a lunar cycle. We didn't know yet that the lunar length cycle is the most fertile cycle of women, and as women's cycles get shorter or longer, they become subfertile, less likely to be able to get pregnant, even if they get some sperm injected through their body and into the fallopian tube. They're less likely to conceive a pregnancy. All we knew then was the cycle length seemed to be related to the sexual behavior. After that, I switched from psychology to move into the biology department because my faculty in the psych department correctly said I didn't belong there. Given the interest that I had, which is the physiology, the endocrine system, they thought I should shift to biology, and I was fortunate to shift to the biology department at Penn. And my faculty, the one woman professor that I told you about, was my advisor, and she said, "That's a really interesting pilot work. We really ought to replicate it and do it properly, have the data of the sexual behavior collected prospectively during the same semester as the cycles and a bunch of other information." Ultimately, we found the exact same pattern when it was prospective. The women who recorded that they had intercourse or they slept with a partner, the women who had regular sex with a partner tended to have fertile type cycles. And it didn't matter if it was twice a week or once a week. Once a week seemed to be sufficient. Now that's biblical. If you read Leviticus, Leviticus advises husbands to tend to their wife at least once a week, that it's a rule. And that's why I was asking about weekly, because I had looked at the patterns in Leviticus. And a lot of these science papers that I did came right out of there. They were forming the questions that allowed me to test the rules that were in Leviticus. Or were they good for health? Or were they good for fertility? And these were rules that turned out to be very good for fertility. They also advised that a woman should not have sex when she's menstruating. That's in Leviticus also. And I now understand that that was probably right too, because if a woman is orgasmic, it means her uterus is contracting. And if she's bleeding and she's menstruating, it means the lining of the uterus is coming down as blood flow. But she has two other tubes going, they're fallopian tubes. And if you squeeze the blood because of a contracting uterus because of orgasm, I can imagine blood moving up into the fallopian tubes, out into the body, and the disease endometriosis. Has anybody ever heard of that disease, endometriosis? Several people have, and those are people older than most of you. I asked my professor who became my mentor, who was a reproductive endocrinologist and a reproductive surgeon, Celso Garcia, and he said, "Wow, what an interesting idea," because they were treating endometriosis patients who were suffering from pain because the blood that had moved out of the uterus into the body had hormones in it, and that was embedding in tissue all over the body and multiplying and growing. So that every time the hormones were causing the uterus to do things, they were causing parts of the body to contract and have a lot of pain, and it took surgery to remove that tissue. So he thought that was interesting, but it really came out of Leviticus, what behaviors made sense. Ultimately, we continued that study with another one and looked for fertility not just by cycle length, another year, but by basal body temperature graphs. A woman can put a thermometer under her tongue every morning before she gets out of bed and record her temperature. And there will be a pattern of the temperature will swing up and down. When she ovulates, it will change. When she's finished ovulating, when she's in her luteal phase, it will change again. And a smart woman who reads and knows how to do it can see when is her fertile moment and when is she not likely to conceive. And it was used as regulation for avoiding pregnancy, but that's a different issue than what we're talking about here. But what we found here was, among 83 women in another year in another study, 90% of the women who had weekly coitus had a fertile basal body temperature graph, whereas 54% of the women who had sporadic patterns of sexual behavior had a fertile basal body temperature graph, and even lower, the ones who were abstinent from sex had even lower. So there's something in here about regular sex being associated with a fertile pattern. We don't know whether being fertile makes a woman have more sex, or does having more sex make her be more fertile, because associations are not causality. But the relationship was interesting to us.